At the height of World War II, generals believed victory belonged to giants of steel, until a machine barely larger than a truck, dismissed as a toy, changed everything on the blood-soaked flanks of Moscow. Soviet factories, cornered, bombed, almost broken, flooded the battlefield with thousands of T-60 tanks, tiny machines that did not just survive, but proved decisive when heavier armor was nowhere to be found. Why did armies gamble on these little machines, and how did a vehicle so small help shape the outcome of the world's greatest conflict? The answer reveals a story of desperation, innovation, and battlefield cunning you have never truly heard. In the closing months of World War I, a new kind of war machine rumbled across the muddy fields of France. The Renault FT, weighing just over 6 tons and manned by only 2 crew members, rolled into history as the first tank to feature a fully rotating turret. Unlike its lumbering British and German counterparts, the FT was compact, nimble, and cheap enough to build by the thousands. By 1918, nearly 3,000 units had left French factories, their silhouettes soon copied or adapted in factories from Italy to Japan. The FT's influence spread rapidly. The United States produced its own version, the M1917, while Italy developed the Fiat 3000. Poland, the Soviet Union, and even China imported or reverse-engineered the design, seeing in its small frame a way to field armor without the crushing expense of heavy tanks. In the years that followed, the world's armies began to experiment with vehicles even smaller than the FT. Tankettes, tiny 2-man tracked boxes armed with machine guns, proliferated across Europe and Asia. Italy's CV-33, Poland's TKS, and the British Carden Loyd all promised mobility and mass, not brute force. For many militaries, the appeal was clear. Light tanks could be produced quickly and in large numbers, a vital advantage for countries with limited industrial muscle or tight budgets. In the Soviet Union, a sprawling nation with vast frontiers and patchwork infrastructure, planners saw small tanks as the answer to rapid mechanization. The Red Army's early T-18 and T-26 drew directly from the FT's formula: 2 crew, light armor, and a gun, just powerful enough to deal with infantry and machine gun nests. Strategists in the 1920s and 1930s argued that these vehicles had a place far beyond the parade ground. Light tanks could scout ahead of heavier formations, support infantry in forests and villages, and exploit breakthroughs in ways that ponderous giants could not. In colonial campaigns and border skirmishes, small tanks crossed bridges too flimsy for heavy armor and navigated roads little wider than a cart track. The ability to scout, to move first, and see first became a central selling point. By the eve of World War II, the light tank and its even smaller cousins had become a global phenomenon. France, Britain, Japan, and the Soviet Union all fielded fleets of compact armored vehicles, convinced that numbers and speed could compensate for thin armor and modest firepower. The Renault FT's legacy was not just a blueprint, but a new doctrine. In a world where wars were fought across forests, mountains, and villages, sometimes the smallest tank could do what no heavy could manage. When crisis struck and the Red Army faced disaster, it was this inheritance, the belief that a tiny, quickly built machine could tip the balance, that would shape the next chapter of armored warfare. Theories about armored warfare in the 1920s and the 1930s often revolved around a single word: speed. Soviet planners, inspired by the concept of deep battle, imagined vast columns of tanks driving deep behind enemy lines, cutting supply routes and sowing confusion. But those ambitions ran headlong into hard limits. Heavy and medium tanks like the T-34 and the KV-1 required specialized steel, powerful engines, and complex transmissions, resources that were scarce, expensive, and concentrated in a handful of vulnerable factories. For a country stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific, with railways and roads often little more than dirt tracks, a different solution was needed. Mobility theorists argued that armies needed tanks that could cross rickety bridges, traverse muddy fields, and squeeze down forest trails. This thinking favored the production of smaller, lighter vehicles. Factories designed for trucks or tractors could be retooled to build these compact tanks, using commercial engines and simple gearboxes. The logic was straightforward. Better to have 10 light tanks in the field than a single heavy machine stuck in a workshop or bogged in a marsh. Mobility mattered more than armor alone. Budget constraints sharpened these choices. The Great Depression slashed military spending worldwide, forcing armies to prioritize quantity over sophistication. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's push for rapid mechanization meant that every available assembly line had to contribute. Small plants, unable to handle the massive castings or thick armor plates required for heavy tanks, could still churn out thin-skinned hulls and basic turrets. The result was a network of factories producing light tanks and tankettes by the hundreds, each one a compromise between ideal protection and the realities of steel, labor, and time. Production and pragmatism drove design. This industrial realism dovetailed with evolving battlefield doctrine. Light tanks were not designed to slug it out with enemy armor. Instead, they scouted ahead, screened flanks, and provided fire support for infantry. Their lightweight allowed them to cross makeshift bridges and move through woods or villages where heavier vehicles simply could not go. Soviet manuals emphasized speed, surprise, and maneuver, using mobility to offset thin armor and modest firepower. The purpose of these vehicles was intelligence, flexibility, and tactical reach rather than head-to-head confrontation. By the late 1930s, these ideas had hardened into policy. The Red Army's armored forces were structured around a mix of heavy, medium, and light vehicles, but the bulk of new production orders went to the smallest types. When war erupted and the Soviet Union faced disaster in 1941, the earlier decisions forced a stark choice: accept the limitations of light armor or risk having no tanks at all. The intellectual case for mobility and the practical constraints of industry had set the stage for an emergency gamble, a bet that a tiny, quickly built tank could still make a difference on the battlefield. Gamble and necessity became one and the same. Orders arrived from Moscow with the weight of survival behind them. In late August 1941, as German armies closed on the industrial heartland and evacuation trains clogged the rails, the State Defense Committee issued a top-secret directive, catalogued as GKO Decree 179SS. The language left no room for debate. Every automobile and tractor plant not yet dismantled or bombed was to begin immediate production of a new light tank, the T-60. The directive specified that it must use commercial engines, simplified armor, and whatever steel could be found. There would be no waiting for better designs, no time for ideal specifications. Factories like GIAZ in Gorky, still intact but already hearing air raid sirens, received the orders alongside a flood of technical drawings and raw material requests. Plant directors faced a choice that was no choice at all. They either retooled overnight or risked being accused of sabotage. The evacuation of Kharkov and Leningrad tank plants was underway. Machines and workers loaded onto flat cars, entire assembly lines disappearing east. With T-34 and KV production grinding to a halt, the Red Army's armored strength was collapsing faster than anyone could replace it. Nikolai Astrov, chief designer at GIAZ, found himself under direct orders to deliver a tank that could be built with automotive parts, welded from whatever armor plate was available, and powered by the GAZ-202 truck engine. The design brief was defined by what was left, not what was wanted. Armor was thinned to save weight and steel. The 20mm TNSH gun, adapted from aircraft, became the main weapon because it was the only cannon available in numbers. Crew space shrank to a bare minimum, just a driver and a commander who doubled as gunner, loader, and radio operator when a radio could be found. Every compromise was forced by the clock. The decree demanded that the first tanks roll off the line within weeks, not months. Factories scrambled to improvise. Welding teams worked double shifts. Machinists repurposed truck gearboxes, and supply officers scoured the region for sheet steel and engine parts. In some shops, armor plates were cut by hand when power failed during blackouts. The urgency was absolute. If the tiny tank could not be built now, there might soon be no tanks at all. The T-60 was born not from engineering ambition, but from the desperate arithmetic of survival. Every machine a wager that numbers, not perfection, could hold the line until the heavy factories breathed again. Designing the T-60 meant accepting a series of trade-offs that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The GAZ Design Bureau, led by Nikolai Astrov and his team, faced a blunt reality. The only way to build tanks fast enough was to use what was already on hand. The T-60 would run on the GAZ-202 engine, a 6-cylinder gasoline unit pulled straight from the factory workhorse trucks. This decision was not about performance, it was about survival. Specialized tank engines, especially the powerful V2 diesels needed for T-34s, were in short supply and reserved for heavier vehicles. Truck engines, while less robust and more prone to overheating under the strain of battle, could be produced by the thousands with existing tooling and parts. The same logic shaped every aspect of the T-60 construction. Armor thickness was set by what the automotive presses could handle, mostly 15 to 20 millimeter plates, sometimes thinner when steel was scarce. Instead of intricate castings, the hull and turret were pieced together from flat, welded plates, a method that allowed even small plants to join the production effort. The turret itself was an 8-sided polygon, not for ballistic advantage, but because it could be cut and assembled quickly from standard sheets. Even the tracks and suspension borrowed heavily from commercial vehicles, relying on leaf springs and stamped components designed for trucks rather than tanks. Weaponry was another compromise. The Red Army preferred the 45mm tank gun, but that weapon was in short supply, with most diverted to anti-tank units or larger vehicles. The T-60 was instead fitted with the TNSH, a 20mm autocannon adapted from aircraft use. It offered enough punch to deal with infantry, machine gun nests, and lightly armored vehicles, but it was never intended for dueling with enemy tanks. The cramped interior left only enough room for 2 crew members, a driver, and a commander who also loaded, aimed, and fired the gun. Radios were installed only when available. Otherwise, signal flags and hand gestures had to suffice. Every design decision reflected the pressure of the moment. Factories could not wait for specialized equipment or perfect materials. The T-60 was built to be assembled by workers used to making trucks, using presses and welding rigs already in place. What mattered was speed. A tank that could be built today with the tools and steel at hand was worth more than a better tank promised months down the line. In this way, the T-60's small size and modest armament were not flaws, but the direct result of a calculated gamble, one that traded firepower and protection for the chance to put armor back on the battlefield before it was too late. A hull of welded steel plates, angled for deflection, forms the T-60's shell. The thickest point sits at the glacis, 35 millimeters of armor on late production models. The sides and turret are thinner, dropping to 15 millimeters, and the rear is thinner still. This steel was never meant to stop a direct hit from a German anti-tank gun, but it could shrug off machine gun fire and shrapnel, giving the crew a fighting chance in the chaos of battle. The turret, an 8-sided polygon, was designed for speed of assembly, not elegance. Flat plates could be cut and welded by workers trained on trucks and tractors, not heavy armor. The geometry, while simple, allowed for faster repairs at the front and easier adaptation to whatever steel was available. The main weapon, a 20mm TNSH autocannon, was adapted from an aircraft gun and could fire up to 750 rounds per engagement. Paired with a 7.62mm DT machine gun, it gave the T-60 enough firepower to suppress infantry, destroy light vehicles, and harass enemy positions. Against heavier German tanks, the TNSH could sometimes penetrate side armor at close range, but it was never meant for slugging matches. Mobility defined the T-60's battlefield presence. A Giaz 202 6-cylinder gasoline engine rated at 70 horsepower pushed the tank to speeds of up to 44 kilometers per hour on roads. The power-to-weight ratio hovered near 11 horsepower per ton, enough to keep the tank moving over mud, snow, and broken ground. The light frame and narrow tracks allowed it to cross makeshift bridges and traverse narrow forest trails where heavier tanks bogged down. Operational range reached 360 kilometers on roads, though in practice, fuel shortages and mechanical wear often cut that short. Every element of the T-60's design was a compromise between what was possible and what was necessary. Armor was as thick as the presses could handle. The gun was the largest available in quantity. The engine and suspension borrowed from trucks, chosen for reliability and the ability to be built by the thousands. These numbers were not just specifications. 35 millimeters of armor, 44 kilometers per hour, a 2-man crew, defined what the tank could endure, where it could go, and how it would fight. Inside the T-60, space is measured in inches. The driver sits low in the hull, knees pressed against the gearbox, shoulders brushing cold steel. To his right, the commander folds himself into the 8-sided turret, a post that is less a seat than a cramped hollow. There is no room to stretch, and barely enough to turn. In summer, heat from the engine and the gun turns the compartment into a furnace. In winter, metal breathes frost, and the crew's breath fogs the periscope glass. For the 2 men inside, every task competes for space and attention. The driver watches the world through a narrow slit, straining to read the ground ahead, while engine noise drowns out shouted words. The commander becomes a one-man orchestra, eyes searching for threats, hands loading the 20mm TNSH cannon, finger on the trigger, elbow ready to swing the turret. If a radio is fitted, it adds another layer, headphones pressed tight, listening for orders, relaying what little he can see. Without a radio, he signals with flags or by rapping on the hull, hoping the driver understands. Ammunition boxes line the floor and sides, crowding knees and ankles. Movement is a negotiation with the shells and the steel. When the gun fires, cordite smoke fills the turret, stinging eyes and throats. The smell of oil, sweat, and burnt powder never leaves. Escape hatches are small and awkward. In a rollover or under fire, getting out can turn into a desperate scramble. Visibility is limited by tiny vision ports and a single periscope. Blind spots are everywhere. The commander's world is a patchwork of glimpses, snowdrifts, tree trunks, the flash of a muzzle. He must decide, in seconds, whether to fire, move, or call for help. Fatigue sets in quickly. Long hours behind armor mean aching backs, numb fingers, and a constant ache of worry. Crews improvise to survive. Extra padding goes on seats, Gloves keep hands from freezing to the gun, and lucky tokens are tied to the turret ring. Small adjustments become routine, small comforts become sacred. Every mission begins with the knowledge that the tank's armor will not stop a direct hit. Survival depends on speed, surprise, and luck. And yet, for many, the T-60 is more than a metal box. It is a lifeline, a way to fight back, to move forward, to hold the line when nothing else stands between them and the enemy. In the silence between battles, the men talk quietly, sharing cigarettes and stories, knowing that the next time the hatch slams shut, it could be for the last time. Night falls over Gorky, but the factory gates never close. The GAZ plant, battered by air raids and shaken by blackout alarms, hums with the sound of welders and presses pushing through the darkness. Workers pour in for the night shift, some still in soot-stained overalls, others with bandaged hands from the last emergency repair. Each man and woman knows the quota. Hundreds of T-60 hulls must leave the line this month, no matter the bombs or broken windows. On the floor, sparks fly as armor plates are joined, sometimes cut by hand when power flickers out. Welding teams improvise, rerouting cables, patching holes in the roof, scavenging steel from shattered machinery. In the chaos, a rhythm takes hold. One hull finished, another turret mounted, tracks hammered into place by the glow of lanterns. When the air raid sirens wail, production halts for minutes, not hours. As soon as the all-clear sounds, crews scramble back to their stations, racing the clock and the next attack. At the peak, the plant sends out as many as 15 T-60 tanks a day, their engines barely cooled before being loaded onto flat cars bound for the front. Stories ripple through the workforce. A welder who slept beside his workbench for a week, machinists who repaired their own lathes with scavenged parts, teams who worked by candlelight when the city grid failed. Pride and exhaustion walk side by side. Every tank that rolls out is a small victory, a promise to soldiers at the front that help is on the way, forged by hands that refuse to stop, even when the sky is falling. Flat cars line up in the early morning haze, their decks bristling with fresh T-60 tanks, paint barely dry, engine oil still warm from the test run. At Jazz and other auto plants, the race to the front does not pause for ceremony. Crews work in teams, guiding each tank up the ramps, checking fuel, and lashing down tracks with rough hemp rope. The process is relentless. As soon as a batch is ready, the yard boss waves the signal, and the convoy inches eastward. Railways become arteries of survival. Each armored train threads its way through bombed-out junctions and frozen sidings, past columns of refugees and supply cars. The first shipments leave Gorky in October 1941, barely weeks after the initial orders. Every hour counts. The Red Army's needs are urgent, and the factories answer with speed, sometimes loading tanks straight from the assembly line, with workers and mechanics riding alongside to handle breakdowns en route. At transfer points, teams swarm over the cars, checking for loose bolts, topping off fuel, and fitting winter camouflage as the weather turns. Some tanks arrive with welds still warm, their serial numbers chalked on hastily. In the chaos of war, paperwork is a luxury. What matters is that each machine reaches the front intact. By the time the T-60 tanks roll off the flat cars and onto muddy tracks near Moscow or the Don, they are already battered by the journey, paint chipped, tracks dusted with coal soot. Yet their arrival is a signal. New armor has reached the line. The logistical chain, stretched thin and threatened by air raids and sabotage, delivers not just machines, but hope. Each trainload is another chance to hold against the enemy, proof that the factories behind the lines are still fighting, one tank at a time. Snow muffles the sound of engines as a pair of T-60s creep through the birch woods northwest of Moscow. In December 1941, the 27th Tank Brigade's light tanks move in single file, tracks barely leaving a mark on the frozen earth. German machine gun fire crackles from a nearby village, but the tanks keep to the tree line, using their size to vanish behind trunks and brush. At a signal, they surge forward, guns spitting at enemy emplacements. Infantry follows close, emboldened by the armor's presence. In minutes, the defenders scatter, leaving behind shattered nests and abandoned rifles. The tanks reverse, slipping back into the woods before German artillery can answer. August 1942. High in the Caucasus. A battered wooden bridge spans a mountain stream, its planks groaning under the weight of retreating Red Army columns. German forces press hard, counting on the terrain to stop any Soviet armor. But the T-60s, barely heavier than a loaded truck, cross one by one. Their low profile and tight turning radius let them snake up the switchbacks, engines straining in the thin air. At Goitink Pass, a platoon takes up position behind a hairpin bend. When German infantry rounds the corner, expecting only riflemen, the autocannon opens fire at point-blank range. The pass holds for another day, the tanks hidden in the folds of the mountain. In the ruins of a village west of Kalinin, a T-60 idles in the shadow of a collapsed barn. The commander, hunched in the turret, watches the road through a cracked periscope. German supply trucks rumble closer, unaware. The tank lunges forward, firing as it bursts from cover. Two trucks jackknife into a ditch, and the T-60 is already gone, darting into an alley before the escort can react. Local partisans later recall the little tank that appeared from nowhere, then vanished just as quickly. January 1943, east of Leningrad. Lieutenant Dmitry Osatyuk's T-60 sits exposed on open ground, deliberately baiting German Panzer III tanks. Shells kick up mud around the hull, but Osatyuk holds position, radioing coordinates to Soviet artillery. As the German tanks advance for the kill, Soviet guns thunder from hidden positions. Two enemy tanks burn before the rest retreat. Osatyuk and his driver, Starshina Makarenkov, survive the barrage and receive the Hero of the Soviet Union for their actions. In each of these moments, the T-60's size and speed turn terrain into an ally, giving Soviet forces options where none should exist. A tank's reputation is often measured by its size and firepower, but doctrine tells a more complicated story. In the hands of a skilled crew, the smallest armored vehicle can punch far above its weight if it is in the right place at the right time. The T-60, with its low silhouette and nimble frame, offered a kind of battlefield invisibility that heavy tanks simply could not match. Historians point to the geometry of ambush. A tank that hugs the ground behind a snowbank or a tree line can open fire and vanish before enemy gunners can respond. In the forests and villages of the Eastern Front, this meant the difference between life and death, not just for the crew, but for the infantry counting on their support. Doctrine manuals from the early 1940s spell out the logic. Light tanks like the T-60 were never meant to face enemy armor head-on. Instead, they scouted, screened, and harassed, striking supply columns, machine gun nests, and artillery positions, then melting away into cover. Their value lay in what larger tanks could not do: cross rickety bridges, slip down farm lanes, and set up firing positions in places a panzer would never fit. In these roles, the T-60's so-called strengths turned weaknesses into advantages. Comparisons with heavier Soviet and German tanks reveal the trade-offs. The T-34, with its thick armor and powerful gun, dominated open fields and tank duels, but it could not creep through a ruined village or switch back up a mountain trail. The T-60, by contrast, could set up an ambush at a bend in the road, fire on a convoy, and disappear before return fire arrived. Infantry squads often described a surge of confidence when a T-60 appeared at their flank. Even a small tank, with thin armor and a 20mm cannon, gave riflemen the edge to storm a bunker or hold a crossroads. German reports dismissed these machines as no serious threat, but after-action logs tell a different story. Losses of trucks, guns, and even light armored vehicles to T-60 raids forced German commanders to divert anti-tank guns and air support to deal with these so-called toys. The psychological effect was real. The sudden appearance of a tank, any tank, could break up an attack or slow a retreat. Myths about light tanks as useless coffins ignore this reality. The record shows that, in the right hands and under the right doctrine, the smallest tank could change the outcome of a battle, not by brute force, but by being everywhere the enemy least expected. Inside a glass-walled gallery, a museum curator stands beside a T-60, its riveted plates and battered paintwork preserved in the quiet. The tank looks almost out of place among its larger, more imposing descendants. Yet, as the curator explains, the T-60's legacy is written into every modern armored vehicle designed for reconnaissance and support. Its silhouette, so low to the ground, foreshadowed the armored scout cars and tracked recon vehicles that would come to define post-war doctrine. When engineers in the 1950s and 1960s debated new vehicles for fast-moving, combined arms warfare, they returned to the lessons of the T-60: mobility, ease of concealment, and the ability to operate where main battle tanks could not. Technical blueprints and field manuals from the years after World War II often reference the T-60's role in shaping a new generation of light armored vehicles. The Soviet Union's BRDM and BMP series, Britain's CVRT family, and even the American M551. Sheridan all reflect a doctrinal thread that began with the need for speed and flexibility under fire. Instructors at armored schools study the T-60's deployment in forests, villages, and mountain passes, noting how its small size allowed it to slip through gaps, scout enemy lines, and support infantry in places where heavier tanks became liabilities. The curator points to a faded field report, preserved in the archives. It describes a T-60 platoon using a narrow farm bridge to cross a river at night, relaying enemy positions back to divisional headquarters. That act, simple, almost routine, would become a template for modern reconnaissance missions. Vehicle designers still debate the balance between firepower, protection, and mobility, but the T-60's example endures. Sometimes, the best armored vehicle is not the strongest, but the one that arrives first, unseen. Today, armored doctrine around the world recognizes that information and speed can be as decisive as armor thickness. Modern reconnaissance vehicles, from Russia's BMD vehicles to NATO's Fennec, owe a debt to a wartime design forged in crisis. In the museum's quiet, the T-60 stands as a reminder that the smallest machines often leave the longest shadows, shaping the thinking of generations that follow. On today's battlefields, technology still favors those who adapt, sometimes with less, not more. The T-60 proved that speed, simplicity, and sheer numbers can halt an enemy that strength alone cannot. As militaries now invest billions in heavyweight armor, history warns that underestimating the smallest tool may cost the greatest victory. Innovation, born from necessity, remains the weapon armies can never afford to ignore. What overlooked solutions are we missing now?